Assalamu alaikum, hello and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. In today's program, we're going to talk about the Mughal Empire, and I'm joined by my experts again. So Amjad, welcome again, Amjad Hussain from Leeds.
Thank you very much.
And Arif Ahmad from Spen Valley, both avid history thinkers and speakers. Walaikum salam. So, the Mughal Empire was the second largest to have existed in the Indian subcontinent, spanning 4 million square kilometers, which is a bit difficult to show on a radio program, but it was big across the whole of India virtually. And it was probably the only second biggest to the Mauryan Empire, which, of course, Ashoka the Great was the great conqueror ruler of the Mauryan Empire at its maximum, which was 5 million square kilometers as well. The Mughal Empire was essentially a Muslim empire, and it was founded by Babur. And the Mughal emperors were Central Asian Turco-Mughals belonging to the Timurid dynasty, and who were also related to Genghis Khan of the great Mongol Empire. So I think before we speak about the great Mughals of India, let's look at the origins where they came from and the Mughal Empire. Amjad, if I could start with yourself. A lot of people, virtually everybody knows who Genghis Khan was, but just explain the linkage and how it all started.
Well, Genghis Khan is known as the Great Khan, or Genghis, and Khan means king. Was born as Temujin. He was a great warrior, conqueror, and founder of the great founder of the Mughal Empire, basically. He united many of the nomadic tribes of northeastern Asia and embarked on series of conquests of the Eurasian plains, mainly Central Asia, Western Europe, and much of Russia. One of his sons, Ogadale Khan, he was succeeded by one of his sons, Ogadale Khan, who took much of the empire, but the rest of the empire was divided among his various sons. One of his sons, Chagatai Khan, and his son converted to Islam, and he became known as Barke Khan, or he took on the Islamic name of Ghiyasuddin Barke Khan. And Barke Khan, he became the Khan of the central Khanate of the Chagatai Khanate, which consisted mainly of present-day Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Afghanistan.
I think just before we get to how Islam came, generally speaking, the Mongols were a warring group, Arif, weren't they? I mean, you look at any documentary, see any movie, and you see them just absolutely devastating all empires and conquering everything in its path.
I think they are one of the people that actually deserve their reputation, because obviously they were very brutal. So, sometimes films and Hollywood overplay that, but I think if you look at the history, they were fairly devastating. Obviously, at that time, it was more about power, political power. The religion, as you said, sort of came in later. So one of the descendants of Genghis Khan, Hulagu Khan, who was the grandson of Genghis Khan, he's famous for one of these sieges. I mean, his own religion, I think he was not particularly religious. He had nominally some religion, Christianity, Buddhism, but nothing that played a major part.
I think the majority of the Mongols, I've read another name for it, but basically they were shamanism, which is sort of the natural, animistic type religion, believing in nature, etc. Because certainly Genghis Khan, that's what he essentially believed, although he allowed many other religions to exist, and up to Hulagu as well, that was the case.
Absolutely. I mean, they were, as I said, they were fairly neutral in the sense of it wasn't about religion, it was about conquest, all types of people. And Hulagu's main conquest came at the siege of Baghdad. This links in with one of our earlier programs, the Abbasid Caliphates. And it was the Caliph Al-Mutasim who was ruling Baghdad at that time. It was a brutal siege. The number of people killed, in some accounts, it may be as many as 1 million people. But let's say it was a few 100,000 people at least. Even the Caliph Al-Mutasim, he was also brutally killed. The legend is that he was wrapped up in a carpet so that his blood would not be shed on the earth. There was a legend about how that could cause problems for the people that did that, but the horses and the carriages were run over him, and he was killed in that brutal sort of way. So sometimes this was done to set an example to show how bloodthirsty and how great warriors they were.
Certainly the name of Halagu was used by all cultures to say, just be quiet and don't, to children, etc. as well in those days, wasn't it? Otherwise he's going to come and...
Absolutely, keep you in check.
Keep you in check. Yeah, Halaku, actually the now word halak, which means to assassinate, has found its way into many lexicons and much of the vocabulary of Central Asia, the Persian language as well as Urdu, and is used in modern day Urdu to mean to assassinate and to kill, is named after Halaku Khan.
Interesting, Amjad, you mentioned early on that obviously after Genghis Khan passed away, the Khanate or the empire was split up and Halagu was sort of covering one part of it. Just describe a little bit more of was it amongst his sons and grandsons that he split the different empires into different sections?
Actually, the Mongols didn't... The Khan, the chief Khan or the king, the Khan himself wasn't always succeeded by his eldest son. They're the practice where the spoils and the territory was split between many sons and grandsons, and they coexisted. And at times they feuded and they waged war against each other for succession and so on. So there was a lot of relative competition among themselves as well. But they united in overall against all external forces and foes and so forth. But at times they quarrel for succession and so on.
I suppose it's that phrase of blood is thicker than water, but they still would like fighting with each other, and it's.
Well, that's one thing they didn't do at that stage, that they kept their. But there was an interesting scenario and development there, wasn't it? Because as it was split up into these four khanates, you had Halagu who was pushing against the Muslims in the Muslim lands in particular. And you mentioned earlier on Barke Khan. I mean, my understanding was that I don't know who was he descended from. Barke Khan, do you know?
Barke Khan was descended from Chagadai Khan, and at that time, as you quite rightly said, the four khanates existed. The most western one was called the Golden Horde,
right,
which basically was based around the Caucasus, southern Russia, and much of western and southern Europe. And there's one, the Chagatai Khan, the Khanate mainly controlled Central Asia, and then there was one Khanate that controlled Afghanistan and Persia. And in China and much of Mongolia, the Jung dynasty, and which is basically Kublai Khan, existed. So basically, these four Khanates, they had their own Khans or a ruler or a king. They coexisted with each other. They competed for territory, for prestige, power, and so forth. And they had rivalries, but they were united against their foreign foes and so forth. But like you said, when the empire had reached its zenith, and there was a lot of bloodletting, as my esteemed colleague Arif has alluded to. When they settled down, they started to question each other's brutality, who was more vicious and who was more noble and so forth.
This is the interesting bit, isn't it? Because my understanding was Barke was pushing in Europe on behalf of the empire. And while Halagu was attacking the Mamluks and really trying to expand Baghdad, Syria, etc. And my understanding is Barke Khan was heading back from Europe towards Mongolia for a break. And he stopped to find out a little bit more about, what are all these Muslims up to? What is their religion? And that's when he converted to Islam. And he was actually a cousin, wasn't he, of Halagu? And when he realized what Halagu had done to Baghdad, that's when the civil war and the fighting between the Khans started as well. But I mean, the impact of Islam was to change these nomadic people massively in the end. What are your thoughts?
Well, Barke had liaisons because there was competition, but among the Khanates, the Golden Horde, the Central Asian Khanate, and the Khanate by Kublai Khan. So they made alliances, they made peace, they made war with themselves and with external kings and sultans as well. So these people were exposed to Islam and the high culture of Islam and culture and civilization, particularly the Persian, the Abbasid Caliphate, and so forth. Burke was much influenced by the teachings of the Prophet and the early Muslims and so forth. And when he learned that one of his cousins, Hilaku, had laid devastation to the city of Baghdad, which was at that time the most civilized capital of an empire, which was basically...
it was in the world, to be honest. It was the most civilized place.
And he burned down libraries. Yeah. There was massacres, and that didn't go down particularly well with Burke. And then I think it is also said that he met certain pilgrims on the route back from Mecca or Medina, and he was overwhelmed by the
brotherhood and feeling.
And also he learned from the many teachings how Prophet was a very pluralist leader, very kind and caring, and he learned from the Hajis that how Prophet, he consolidated and he forgave his worst enemies. He was a beacon of mercy and compassion, and he just basically, his eyes welled up. And these are legends, but of course we have to take them with a pinch of salt.
But they had a big impact
certainly
on
the
him.
Civilization of Islam had a great impact on him, and subsequently converted to Islam and took the name of Islamic name of Ghiyasuddin Burke Khan, and then of course his great grandson, obviously this success he was succeeded by his sons who were more adherent to Islam, and subsequently they will fight and under the banner of Islam rather than for any.
We're going to come to those, but one of the interesting things was that as I said, when he learnt about the siege of Baghdad, he wrote to Halagu and said, you will pay for this because that was the wrong thing to be done. And he later on joined up with the Mamluks as well to stop Halagu's push towards Syria and further on into Egypt. Then we fast forward, I suppose, because many of the prominent Mongols or the Khans became Muslims, and out of the 4 Khanates, 3 of them basically had accepted Islam as the sort of state religion, as the major religion. And so when we come to the next major figure that I want to talk about, which is Timur Lane Arif, his empire was essentially also a Muslim empire as well. But just tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to sort of set the timeline here, this was around the late 14th century, early 15th century when he was in power. He was a Muslim. I think there's a interesting fact about his name. Timur, people will recognize that as a Muslim name. But in Persian and in the West, he was also known as Timur the Lame, which became shortened to Timur Lane.
Yes.
So you could see how the name had developed over time. He basically took control of the Western Chagatai Khanate by 1370. And from there, he used that as a base. And he spread that throughout the West and the South and Central Asia and the Caucasus and Southern Russia, as Amjad Saab was mentioning. And I suppose at that time he emerged as probably the most powerful ruler in the Muslim world. He defeated the Mamluks in Egypt and Syria, and he established his power base. He was I suppose a nomadic conqueror in the sense that he would travel and go to different places to conquer places, similar to Genghis Khan. But as I said, he had a very, very strong base and somewhere where he could basically...
I mean, his armies were feared, and one of the interesting facts that I pulled out was that some scholars apparently estimate that his armies were so powerful that they killed over 17 million people, which amounted to about 5% of the world's population. I mean, that's an incredible amount of power in those days when the populations weren't that great.
And I think even the meaning of his name in some languages, Turkish languages, means iron. So, there was, again, the influence of power dominating people, but maybe done in a slightly more refined way now that they had a Muslim background.
Well, actually, the carnage was resulted, of course, of the military tactics, that of brutality, savagery, and just setting an example and psychological warfare. But let's not forget, most of they introduced also the gunpowder first time into the equation, and mobile cavalry, hit and run tactics, which were never used before.
More sophisticated military tactics.
Basically, mobile horse archers, they will just hit and run into the armies. They will lay siege to any. They will just lay waste to any army, any opposition that they encountered. But let's not forget, they also brought much of artillery and gunpowder to the scene, to the battlefield, and so they were basically brought new tactics and strategies to warfare than their contemporaries.
A little bit, Amjad, about Samarkand, that in those days was sort of the powerful center, and he believed in the Naqshbandi school of thought overall. Can you sort of tell us a little bit more in relation to the impact religion had on
After the
Timur's empire?
Yes, after the fall of Baghdad, Samarkand and Bukhara became prominent centers of learning, because obviously wherever the new Khan or the Sultan was, Amir Taimur inherited the Arabic title of Amir and Sultan as well, and hence power shifted, and people of reading, writing, the poets, artisans flocked to new empires and new centers of power, and he became patron of arts, religious schools, seminaries, and so on. And he also entertained many Sufi groups, and in particularly, as you mentioned yourself, he became fond of the Naqshbandi school of Islamic mysticism, and so once these nomadic people became settled, obviously they became patrons of arts and crafts and religious seminaries, and genuinely they were really the overall influence of Islamic culture, civilization, and the depth and breadth of it. They were just taken aback by the whole teachings of the Prophet, in particularly, and the examples, the life and examples of early Muslim warriors, conquerors, and early the companions of the Prophet who were spreading Islam throughout the Muslim world. So they became like a prototype for these new rulers, as it were.
And how sort of, I understand that Timur also is a great grandfather for Babur, so there was a direct lineage and transition before the sort of the great founder of the Mughal dynasty came about.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Mughal Empire in India and the emperors, basically they regarded themselves as the branch of the Timurid dynasty, and of course, as we know, Babur is the great grandson from Timur, and this empire, the Mughal Empire in India, was started in the 16th century and lasted till up to the 18th century, and we will talk about in detail about the various emperors and their campaigns and failures and successes. But the Mughal Empire mainly corresponded to the modern countries of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And the dynasty, of course, as you mentioned, was Central Asian of Turco-Mughal origin, and from an area that in modern day we can call Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan. And of course, as we mentioned previously, the emperors claim direct descent from both Timur and Genghis Khan. And the first founder of the Mughal Empire in India was no other than Babur himself. He was born in present-day Uzbekistan. He had troubles holding on to his own dominions. He lost many campaigns himself when he was about 14 as a prince, and then he pushed kind of southwards into Kabul, and he became ruler of Kabul. And at that time, let's not forget, much of India was already under Muslim control. There was in India, or in place in India, already something called the Delhi Sultanate, which controlled much of northern India. And the Delhi Sultanate was there from the beginning of the 13th century, and it lasted till the mid 16th century, as it was. So roughly the timeline is 1200 to 1520 AD. And it was contemporary to the Mamluk dynasty, but when Babur arrived on the scene, there was actually the Delhi Sultanate had been taken over by another Afghan Pashtun dynasty, which was a Lodi dynasty. So basically, the Indian rulers at that time were a Muslim Afghan dynasty called the Lodi dynasty that ruled India from 1450, much of northern India, I must say, from 1451 to 1526 is the scene when Babur arrived on the scene. One person by the name of Sultan Ibrahim Lodi, who was the regent, upon his death, he became the Sultan of Delhi in 1517 AD. And following his succession to the throne, there was a rebellion because when Ibrahim Lodi became the Sultan of Delhi, he disbanded some of the military leaders, some of the commanders, and replaced them, with much younger leaders who were more loyal to him, and thus he offended the ruling class and the nobility of that time. And one of the Afghan nobles, he eventually invited Babur to invade India.
Yeah, this is the interesting thing, isn't it, of how he had troubles, obviously, in the central sort of Asian areas, and how he really came into India. Arif?
Yeah, I think that the turning point, or the first real recognised event, I think it's the first Battle of Panipat, which was around 1526. But a little bit of the background to that was the news that came, I think it was actually in Peshawar, that Daulat Khan Lodi had switched allegiances and driven out Alauddin. That's what sort of motivated Babur to march onto Lahore and confront Daulat Khan Lodi. So I think this is, I suppose, historically the start of the Mughal Empire as we would recognize it today. And it was because he was successful in that battle that he established himself as, I suppose, as the first modern day, or the first Mughal emperor. There was a bit of a glitch in that he was defeated. I think it took him a long time to consolidate power. As with any empire, just because you win the battle doesn't mean everything is fine. So it took time for him to sort of settle down. And I think it was the Sur Empire that sort of interrupted his reign, and he, I think, went back to Persia. And again, there was more influences from Persia that started to affect the Mughal Empire as well.
That was actually happened to his son Humayun. But what happened with Babur was that after the Battle of Panipat, when he defeated his opponent Ibrahim Lodi, there were many pretenders to the Lodi throne, as it were, in Delhi. And one of Ibrahim Lodi's son and his cousins, they also had claim to the throne of Delhi. So Babur, having defeated him, and then not to forget, they were already in Rajasthan, the Indian kings, the Hindu kings, and they thought, well, now the Muslims are quarreling and fighting among themselves. Let's march on to Delhi and get rid of them for once and for all. Or maybe the Sultan, the whole Sultan of Delhi and the surrounding area was up for grabs because of this warfare between the Lodi Sultan and now Babur having arrived on the scene. So Babur had to fight his way, not just again his main Delhi opponents, but also kings to the south, kings to the east, and kings in the west as well. And it is like that Babur could muster up to 30,000 men, and for the first time he brought I think, artillery onto the scene, battlefield artillery rather than artillery was used mainly by the Mamluks and by the Ottomans in the West, in Turkey, when they confronted the Europeans, when they laid siege to Constantinople. Artillery was previously used to take down the city walls, but first time Babur used this on the battlefield. And also, I think at that time, Babur, when he was ruler of Afghanistan and the ruler of his little principality in Uzbekistan, he flirted with the Ottoman Sultan and with the Safavid Empire to the south as well. These were the two major empires at that time, the Ottomans and the Safavids.
By the time he passed away in 1530, it consolidated quite a large section within India, sort of going from Patna to Peshawar down to Fatehpur Sikri or further down as well. Apart from the geographical limit, I mean, a lot of the great Mughals are renowned for a variety of contributions in terms of art, architecture and all the other things. Did Babur, apart from the military expansion, did he leave any other marks? Obviously, the unifying language was Farsi or Persian by that stage, I assume.
Babur actually went, apart from accomplished general and warrior, he was a skilled statesman and a diplomat and a writer as well. He left his own autobiography, which is well documented, which is known as Baburnama, and it's quite detailed, not just his biography, his own autobiography, but it also documents his military campaigns, his tactics, and then he mentions that how his skillful diplomacy that he used, how he befriended Sultan Salim I and the Sultan sent one of the Ottoman Sultan dispatched Ustad Ali Kulli, the artilleryman of that time, and Mustafa Rumi, the matchlock marksman, and he used these matchlock marksmen and the musketeers in his battle against Ibrahim Lodi, and he was thus able to overwhelm superior forces, and of course he was initially, of course, a Central Asian ruler. So the Hindu kings thought that he was a foreigner. So he had hard time on the Indian plains consolidating his victories.
I was going to say one last thing. I think the Babri Masjid as well, I think, as I understand, was actually built upon by one of his generals.
Right.
So I think that's also one of the legacies that maybe some of
it caused quite a stir in the modern subcontinent of India as well. This is probably a good place to have a break now, and in the second part, obviously, we're going to talk about the rise of the great Mughals, from Akbar really onwards, and we'll start off with Humayun. So let's have a break and we'll come back. Welcome back. In the first part, we were talking about Babur, the father of the Mughal Empire, the great Mughals that we're going to talk about. And Babur had established the Mughal Empire of quite a reasonable size at that stage, but sadly he passed away at the age of 47 on the 5th of January 1531, and he was succeeded by his eldest son Humayun. Arif, poor Humayun, he didn't have an easy time, did he?
He was very much thrown into the deep end, unfortunately. He was very young at the time of his father's death, only about 23, and he was very inexperienced. He hadn't really been groomed, I suppose, because Barbara died at a relatively young age. He didn't have a lot of time to groom his son, to advise him. So he was already starting at a disadvantage.
And he also had a very trusting nature, didn't he? Because he had three other brothers who were quite schemers, really.
Well, I think the advice given to him by his father that was basically, leave your brothers, whatever you. I think the quote is actually, do nothing against your brothers, even though they may deserve it. Now, a lot of older brothers will probably identify with that.
In fact, if you actually look at, he did stick to that, even though those brothers didn't deserve his caring. But Amjad, in relation to looking after the empire that his father had left him, he had a tough time and he lost a lot of it, and not only once but many. But take us through some of those stages.
Well, as Arif has mentioned, Babur was mainly preoccupied with wars and military campaigns and didn't spend much time grooming his children, as it were, and they were relatively young as well. And of course, his new foothold in India he did not allow the new empire to consolidate. So unfortunately, he inherited a relatively unstable Mughal foothold on the Indian subcontinent, and they were also the reminiscent of the Lodi court in Delhi in the background, and they were always plotting and scheming. And I think at one time they were plotting and scheming, and they managed to enrope one of his brothers, who was one of his half brothers, Kamran Mirza, who inherited Kabul and Lahore, and was the governor of Kabul and Lahore from Babur, and the reminiscent of the Lodi Sultanate, one of the Lodi descendants, they colluded with him, and that they agreed initially that with Humayun out of the scene, they will divide the spoils if he was defeated.
So I think there was two main rivals: Sultan Bahadur of Gujarat, who was in the south, and Sher Shah Suri, also known as Sher Khan. These were the two main rivals outside of the family. But as Amjad was saying, that they colluded with family members to actually weaken Humayun's reign, to cause confusion, disharmony, and they took their advantage in terms of gradually weakening his empire and taking land away from him.
Because he eventually actually lose the empire to Sher Shah Suri. Do we know what his sort of background and
Sher
where he
Shah
came
Suri
from?
was mainly a Pashtun Afghan nobleman,
Right.
and basically taking advantage of the chaos in Delhi with the demise of Babur, and then feuding within
The brothers fighting.
the brothers fighting, and also the reminiscent of the Lodi dynasty colluding with some of the Babur's immediate family. So he thought this is a good opportunity. And there was also, as Arif mentioned, there was basically other rivals on the scene as well in southern India, who basically wanted to capitalize on the vacuum, as it were. So Humayun lost the Mughal territories to the Pashtun noble Sher Shah Suri. He marched from the Khyber Pass all the way to Lahore, and took that. And Humayun managed to escape, into Safavid Persian Empire, and he remained there for 15 years.
I think there's an interesting story, isn't it, as he migrated.
I think it was from Lahore to Sindh.
Because he had to go through the desert, and there's an interesting...
very interesting incident. His wife at the time, who was 8 months pregnant, I think she was pregnant with the next Mughal Emperor, Akbar, who we'll come on to talk about in a few minutes. She was 8 months pregnant, and they were basically having to travel through the desert. All the wells had been filled with sand. I think there was very little food, just basically berries. And Humayun, as this great emperor, found himself in a position where his wife, the queen, did not have a horse, and nobody would give up their horse for her. So he gave up his own horse, and he had to travel for a while on a camel while she rode on the horse. And he described this later on as his lowest point in his life, because it shows how the mighty have fallen, how this mighty emperor was basically traveling on a camel in the desert, and his wife was suffering great pain. And there was very little that he could do about it.
And Akbar was actually born in an oasis, wasn't he? He wasn't in a grand palace.
I think it was an oasis garrison, Umarkot, where he was actually born.
What a famous place, I suspect.
In 1542. So yes, I think it would have been a very humbling experience for him, but probably something that he would have remembered for the rest of his life and taken some strength from, because obviously he did get through it.
But I think before he went to Persia, he met up with one of his brothers, and he left Akbar there with him because it was going to be the winter months, and actually, he went with his wife and a few.
Akbar was brought up by maternal uncle back in Kabul.
That's what I mean. So before he went to Persia,
he left Akbar with the uncle there, because that was Babur's stronghold, his father's.
So tell me, so his trip then to Persia, clearly later on, as we'll talk, it proved to be quite fruitful. But it was quite an eye opener for him, wasn't it, when he saw the the Safavid Empire and their openness and their literary greatness, etc.? And
well, the two successor empires to the last Muslim dynasty, the Abbasid dynasty, were the Safavids and the Ottomans, and much of Persia at that time, Iran, as we know, Khorasan, and also the Safavid capital became certainly became center of reading, writing, learning, and there were established universities, and this really greatly impressed Humayun. So he devoted much time to reading, writing, and learning himself, and became fluent in many arts and crafts and Islamic sciences, and he brought astronomy when he obviously regained back his throne again in Delhi. This period they spent in Persian exile, not just that he was able to make diplomatic ties with the Safavis, but also bring a lot of Islamic teachings, particularly those of astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and metaphysics back to the Mughal court. So this really enriched the Mughal court. But of course, instead of now having Central Asian influences, the court had a Persian outlook on life, as it were, and all for the better, because otherwise, we later on we know that we got the great poets and literature that came with it, is also the magnificent Urdu language, which is a hybrid language, greatly influenced by the Persian language itself.
I think because he was treated well in Persia as well, this made him more receptive. They respected him and he respected them. Even people...
Well, in many respects, it was really the greatness of the Shah of Persia.
Absolutely.
Who were Shias at that time, and I think it was Shah Tamas, and for them to welcome a Sunni ruler,
they treated him as royalty.
Treated him so well as royalty. It was amazing. His own brothers were turning on him every other day, and this, but go on, Arif.
So I was just saying that even while he was there, he was making connections and links with people, taking part in the culture and learning from this. And I think, as Amjad Saab just mentioned, he was more receptive to this and brought this back with him when he eventually became successful and re-established the Mughal Empire.
Yeah, because it's interesting, one of his brothers from Kandahar sent a message to the Shah saying, I'll join you, and if you could send him back dead or alive, you can have, half of Afghanistan or Kandahar. And of course, the Shah refused and gave Humayun enough support and cavalry and training and everything to go back. So clearly, the culture of Persia had a major impact, and that in turn we see later on in the developments in India subcontinent. So he gets a band of soldiers together and he marches on to India. So do you...
obviously, yes. I think it was in 1550s that 1550s. I take it.
I think Sher Shah Suri died in 1545.
Yes,
and I think his son died soon after in 1554.
Islam Shah died soon after 54. Soon after thereafter, it was basically he managed to wrestle back his empire, the court of Delhi, from Sher Shah Suri and his successors, and he was successul because of his alliances, the newfound.
And he was still very forgiving of his brothers. In fact, the youngest brother, who used to be the most, I've forgotten. Anyway, he was the most rebellious, but he actually died fighting for him. The other two were, I think, sort of swept away. But he regained his empire, and as with all other rulers, unfortunately, he too had to pass away. Because I want to move on to Akbar in the remaining part of the program.
I think just one small point. I think that something that was different this time is that he had a very able general. I think it's Behram Khan. And previously he was trying to lead the armies himself. So I think he learned from his mistakes and realized that, you don't have to necessarily be the one that leads the fighting. And he had a very able general who basically helped him.
In fact, not only helped him, but then what he did for his younger son later on as well, Behram. So Humayun died on the 27th of January, 1556. And Behram, the wise, general that he was, obviously kept the things initially quiet. And then on the 14th of February, 1556, the 13-year-old Akbar came to the throne with clearly the help of Behram. So Arif, you want to continue?
Well, Behram acted basically effectively as a regent. So I think for the first 5 years of the reign of Akbar, between the ages of 18 to 18, he was his he was his regent, and I suppose he also advised him. He gave him the mentoring and the tutelage, and he also, because he was a military person, he took him under his wing and he helped him to consolidate his power. So he had a strong personality, and that set a good example for Akbar to basically follow when he became the ruler on his own.
I mean, clearly he achieved a great deal, Amjad, and that's why, he was given this title of Akbar the Great, probably one of the greatest emperors the world had seen in every respect, really, a rounded figure. But do you want to share any sort of early developments of how he came to develop such a great personality and become such a magnanimous king who Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, everybody, obviously the Sikhs came later on, but they admire to this day?
Of course, coming from the Mughal dynasty itself, of successive Muslim rulers, of grandeur, but nevertheless, his humble, the way his father was exiled, the way he was born in humble ways, and so on, and they more or less became from riches to rags, as it were, their story. So Babur never forgot that. That had a great impression on him. In his
Akbar,
early days.
you mean?
Akbar,
Mm-hmm.
yes. And the tutelage of the great military leader Bayram Khan certainly helped. So he didn't take anything for granted. He understood that to become a successful ruler, you have to exile on the battlefield. You have to be a warrior. You have to be a statesman. You have to be a good diplomat. So basically, Bayram Khan was a very good mentor to young Akbar. So when Akbar became of age, he was able to establish a centralized system of administration throughout his empire, and he adopted a policy of relative conciliation, and he also consolidated his gains by through marriage and diplomacy instead of through. But of course, there were wars and skirmishes to be fought. But mainly, he thought that was a good policy of appeasing others and being lenient, and so he was managed to preserve and consolidate his foothold, and not just that. In time, during his reign, the Mughal Empire tripled in size and in wealth too, and he created, of course, a very powerful military system and instituted very effective political and social reforms too, and is well known for abolishing the jizya sectarian tax which was imposed on the non-Muslims. And then, of course, he took the non-Muslims, particularly Hindus and Zoroastrians, and appointed them to high posts, both in civil and military posts, and he was the first Muslim ruler really to win the trust and loyalty of the native subjects, because he will participate in the local customs, rituals and festivals, the various cultures and sects that resided within India itself, and that I mean non-Muslims. So he will go to the Jains, he will go to the Hindus and the various castes in the Hindus, not just the ruling and the noblemen, but also the lower castes as well, and thus he established a very pluralistic and tolerant society.
I mean, in terms of geographical size, Arif, at that stage during Akbar's reign, the sort of empire went from Gujarat around sort of, the Bombay to across to Bengal, and then also up to Kabul, and
it was very expansive. Yes,
quite a large.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the title "the Great," people might think that was just purely for his military achievements. It wasn't just for that. I mean, that was a large part of it. I think there's one thing to bear in mind if we just focus on the military achievements. In all of his military campaigns, he was unbeaten. Now, how many emperors can say that? Very often, emperors will suffer setbacks. But because of his military innovations, so for example, the use of fortifications, the use of elephants, cannons as well, these were used actually on the battlefield. This was somebody who was ahead of his time in terms of the way that he planned and organized his army. So this is why he was able then to expand into these areas, northern India and central India as well, because it was planned and organized, and because he knew who to approach at the right time. as Amjad was saying, he had a great diplomacy about him. It wasn't just the military. To really build an empire, you can't just be a military ruler. It's not just about killing people. It's also about winning hearts and minds. That's what we keep hearing these days. And he was very, very effective at doing that, whether it was through marriage, whether it was through adopting local customs, whether it was even by this religious tolerance. This also helped greatly the expansion of his empire.
I mean, in relation to his personality, he was very deep thinker, wasn't he? I think the saint that he sort of is it Chishti?
Nizamuddin Auliya. Not Nizamuddin Auliya, but also Sayyid Ali Hajweri of Ajmer Sharif.
Right. So
yes.
he was quite deeply into sort of following the Sufi traditions up there. And also he highly regarded the other faiths as well, and gave their religious people the time of the day, and got many translations done as well. And also in terms of, you mentioned marriages as well, because he got married, certainly Indian culture has it very prominent, to one of the which Indian dynasty was it?
One of the Rajput dynasty, and Jodha Akbar, and of course there are many films about it. But as you mentioned, not just that, visiting the tombs and shrines of Khwaja Garib Nawaz in Ajmer, where he went obviously to seek his blessing, because he was still didn't have an heir apparent, as it were. But Akbar himself was a great patron of arts and culture. He was fond of literature, and of course he inherited a great library from his father. But unfortunately, because the situation Humayun found himself, he was basically and the military campaigns and to win back his empire, that of his father, he spent a lot of relatively traveling a lot with the caravans, with the military campaigns of his father and so forth. So he didn't have time to get formal schooling, as it was. So Akbar was actually illiterate, but nevertheless, because of his father's emphasis on reading and writing, he became a great patron of arts, and he had many of the Sanskrit literatures translated into Persian, and he was fond of literature, and he created a library at that time in Delhi, had 24,000 volumes, both in Sanskrit, in Hindustani, Persian, Greek, Latin, Arabic, and some Kashmiri languages as well. And it was staffed by many scholars, translators, calligraphers, scribes, and bookbinders. And holy men of all faith, poets and architects and artisans adored his court from all over the world for study and discussion. And Akbar's court at Delhi, at Agra, he held court at Delhi, which was, of course, the capital, but at times he was in Agra. He also founded a new city, Fatehpur Sikri, from scratch. But unfortunately, and of course it did become center of art, wherever he held court, he always had skilled artisans, men of reading, writing, and learning around him, and those with military prowess as well. But he did found this new city called Fatehpur Sikri, but later on it had to be abandoned because of the dwindling supply of water. And water is essential to the thriving of any city, unfortunately, and they soon discovered that they could not sustain it. So basically, Perso-Islamic culture became blended with indigenous Indian elements, and this is what we see, the scene that we have today in the Indian subcontinent, much of the music that we inherited, the cuisine, the arts and crafts, and the design of the architecture that we have, the synthesis of the Islamic, the Arab, the Persian, the Turkish, basically enmeshed and intertwined with indigenous Indian culture. That became now what is known as the Mughal culture, the Mughal architect, the Mughal food. What we have in the United Kingdom, the cuisine is much, really, all these fancy names. We have jalfrazi this, jalfrazi that, degi rice, balti, and all this. This actually goes back to the Mughal court and the Mughal military campaigns and so forth.
I mean, I was just going to say, one of the other great points was the religious tolerance. We touched upon that, but I think just to set that in context, he actually encouraged religious debate. Any Hindus who felt that they had been forcibly converted under previous regimes, he said that they could convert back and that there would be no problems, he actually created this house of worship, Ibadat Khana, which was really supposed to be a place where different groups could come together. It didn't quite work out as he expected. He thought that maybe this would be a place where people could exchange views about religions and build tolerance of other religions. Unfortunately, what tended to happen was people from different faiths come there and were trying to impose their own views. But the intention behind it was no doubt admirable, and it was in keeping with the rest of his life, where he wanted to understand as many religions as possible. Even to today, his legacy with Hindus is very popular. I think there are still hymns and songs sung today in his praise because of his good treatment of the Hindus.
I mean, just touching on that, he tried, some say, to set a sort of a mixed religion, Deen-e-Ilahi. He was traditionally, and when he set off, a traditional Orthodox Sunni, I suppose. But that was sort of an attempt, wasn't it, to mix Hinduism and Islam together, but it never really took off.
Well, actually, most of the documents do say that Akbar and his mother and many members of his family, they were adherent believers of Sunni Hanafi Islam in itself. But nevertheless, for court, I think that was for the purposes of court life,
right.
That he thought that there were multiple truths. And that
I think he also thought that there was no religion that had a monopoly on faith. I think this was his starting point.
Well, in a sense, that is the Islamic viewpoint is also that there are other religions that should be respected and regarded.
Yes,
as long as one was clear about the central tenets of the.
But it's much less clear cut that he actually created a new religion. I don't think it's actually what his intention.
It's not clear cut, but certainly.
I think some people have stretched that. I think quite considerably, haven't they?
Well, it was regarded at that even his own time because one of his they got one of his sons to rebel against him.
Yes,
and that was because in one of the Portuguese, I think it was I think the Jesuit priests, they were allowed to when they visited his court. They mentioned, of course, emphasized the New Testament and so forth, but also they said some derogatory terms about the Prophet and Islam as well, the Jesuits, and that was particularly frowned upon by the Orthodoxy. And because Akbar made no attempts to restrain them, as it were, and he said, well, people should be allowed to speak freely. So here we see at court, first time, the practice of free speech, even if went around against your own religious sentiments, as it were. And I think that's in the backdrop. They thought that Akbar had lost his way, that he was flirting with other religions as such. He wasn't. It's just that. Of course, the world, he encompassed a much wider worldview. And let's not forget, because his own father, when he was exiled in Persia, they were all Sunnis to begin with, but he learned that there is actually two sides to the coin, as it were. There was a Shia Islam as well, and they had a narrative to tell. And this really enriched Akbar himself, that, there are various points of view within Islam, and there are, in the greater debate of religions, there are other worldviews as well.
I think you touched on his interaction with the other nations. You mentioned the Portuguese as well. Clearly, he was a great diplomat as well. He had relations with the Muslim world and the outside world. Arif?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think he was probably the first emperor that actually opened up and started trading with Europe as well. I think there's actually an account of him actually receiving an emissary from Queen Elizabeth. So, that's how far his name, and that's how far he was prepared to trade with people and to meet with people. And this was all a positive thing, because it was opening up the country. It was helping to develop the trade, develop the economy. If you keep your country prosperous, it obviously helps the subjects. It obviously helps build up a legacy, and it helps build a stable economy. And so this commercial expansion and economic development was a great part of his legacy, particularly not just with the local area, but also with Portugal and with other European countries as well.
I think we've probably come towards the end of our program on this bit. Clearly, the legacy of the great Mughals and Akbar in particular is covered by many, many books and films and drama series, etc. And people can find out more. Akbar sadly passed away on the 3rd of October 1605. and the torch was passed on to another great Mughal, which we're going to cover in the next part. But thank you to Amjad and Arif for this really interesting discussion around the Mughal Empire. And inshallah, we will see you next time. So goodbye.